Greetings, brethren, and welcome to another presentation from upa7.org. Today we'll address a very important topic and compare the difference between sacred history and profane history. How do we tell the difference? To look into this, we'll address the following questions. Why is it important to understand sacred history? Who we are as a people, where we come from? And this idea of what is historical revisionism and why it is so dangerous. It's very pervasive throughout much of the history that's presented to us in the world. And how can we develop a historical narratives that avoid the traps of revisionism and private opinionization? You know, history, say, in the last several decades. How do we develop that and make sure we're on the right path? Very important. And we'll learn a lot by examining specific examples from different time periods. That way we can understand how to put together a historical narrative about the history of Rod Storehouse in the last several decades. Very important. So we'll begin with this text for meditation. And I'll read the passage that comes from Life Sketches by Ellen White, page 196, and it reads, "The later history of my life would involve the history of many of the enterprises which have arisen among us, and with which my life work has been closely intermingled. For the upbuilding of these institutions, my husband and myself labored with pen and voice. To notice, even briefly, the experiences of these active and busy years would far exceed the limits of the sketch. Satan's efforts to hinder the work and to destroy the workmen have not ceased, but God has had a care for his servants and for his work. In reviewing our past history, having traveled over every step of advance to our present standing, I can say, praise God. As I see what the Lord has wrought, I am filled with astonishment and with confidence in Christ as leader. We have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history." So, of course, Ellen White is referring to her experience with her husband, James, in the rise and progress of the Great Advent movement starting in 1844. And so there's some important lessons here to see how God is leading his people and protecting his servants, and to recognize the attacks of Satan, who's going to try to come in and counterfeit God's work and create confusion. So how do we know that God's going to lead us in the future? Well, we have nothing to fear except we shall forget how God has led us in the past. So we want to apply these lessons not only for our experiences as Seventh-day Adventists, but the relative recent history of the shepherd's rod. How do we know who God's leading today? So this is the really essential question that we want to examine. So why is the study of sacred history so important? Well, let's look at this passage from Selected Messages, Volume 1, page 101, paragraph 2. It tells us, "The great waymarks of truth, showing us our bearings in prophetic history, are to be carefully guarded, lest they be torn down and replaced with theories that would bring confusion rather than genuine light. I have been cited to the very erroneous theories that have been presented over and over again. Those who advocated these theories presented scripture quotations, but they misapplied and misinterpreted them. The theories supposed to be correct were incorrect, yet many thought them the very theories to be brought before the people. The prophecies of Daniel and John are to be diligently studied." So we need to carefully guard our history as a people and who we are and where we come from, and recognize that, of course, Satan's not going to stand idly by. He's going to bring in all kinds of erroneous theories, and people are going to bring up counterfeit histories and present Scripture to justify themselves. So we want to look at this carefully over time and some examples. So we also need to recognize that prophecy and history work together. Same volume, Selected Messages, Volume 1, page 101, paragraph 2. There are those now living, who, in studying the prophecies of Daniel and John, received great light from God as they passed over the ground where special prophecies were in process of fulfillment in their order. They bore the message of the time to the people. The truth shone out clearly as the sun at noonday. Historical events showing the direct fulfillment of prophecy were set before the people, and the prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events leading down to the close of this earth's history. The scenes connected with the working of the man of sin are the last features plainly revealed in this earth's history. The people now have a special message to give to the world, the third angel's message. Those who, in their experience, have passed over the ground and acted a part in the proclamation of the first, second, and third angel's messages are not so liable to be led into false paths as are those who have not had an experimental knowledge of the people of God. So this is in the context of the rise of the first, second, and third angel's messages in the Adventist Church. I ask many people, even Davidians, cannot explain what is the first, second, third angel's message, when they came, who brought them, and what was the nature of the message. So this is very important history to know and understand and literally have it on the frontlets of our mind, and to go over the experiences of the pioneers before us. Now, we're blessed with the pictorial mode of revelation through the shepherd's rod. Many historical narratives, the charts in particular, almost all of them have an historical narrative or a sacred history. For example, here, the vision in Zechariah 6, the church to and back from the wilderness, her prophetic history and unmistakable symbols. So we have a historical timeline from Pentecost to Pentecost, and then in between, various time periods outlined. So this is an important slice of sacred history. As well, the 11th hour chart, most Davidians will focus on the top half of the chart from the period of the Bible, and the calls the 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 11th hours. But there's also the history before the Bible on the bottom half. So there's a whole rich history in this vision that Seventh-day Adventists have no idea about. So it's called the prophetic history of the gospel, the period before the Bible came and then the period with the Bible. So once again, lots of rich history here for our study and contemplation. Here's another great one, the world's history and prophetic symbols, starting from the antediluvian world, tracing down up to the period of the cross, and then onward in the New Testament era up to Ezekiel 9, on through the world to come, the millennium, and the holy city, the new heavens and the new earth. So this is a wide sweep of historical information outlining the visions in Daniel and Revelation, showing the world's history with these beasts. So once again, these are worthy of our very close study and to examine every detail, because this is the most accurate, the most authoritative timeline of events anywhere. Everything else outside of this is corrupted and will lead people into false paths. So the study of history is crucial to understanding prophecy. So what are some of the historical periods that we're going to examine in this presentation? We're going to look at 4 for illustration. The creation account, the origins, from the beginning, from Genesis. The Protestant Reformation, the 1888 message, and what's more directly applicable to us today is the movement of Rod Storehouse from 1955 up to the present day. This is really essential, but to get a backdrop, we want to look at some prior periods of time. And of course, this illustration is the Reformers' Wall. It's in Zurich, Switzerland, and these are key figures in the Reformation history. So when we look at the origin of life on Earth, there's a true history or a sacred history, and then there's a counterfeit. So let's see how this goes. Well, the book of Genesis begins with the record of creation and how life arose on the planet Earth approximately 6,000 years ago. This is very important because it tells us how we got here. But since the mid-19th century, a variety of counterfeit historical narratives have arose to counteract the Bible narrative. The most notable being publication of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, 3 volumes, 1831 to 1833, and then Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859. Now, Lyell's book is important because it comes up with this counterfeit idea that the geological formations, the strata, the canyons, the mountains, all formed over long geological ages, millions of years. And of course, this directly contradicts the Bible story and the worldwide catastrophic flood, which was the biblical explanation for the very geology of the earth we see today. So this is a counterfeit, and this served as a basis, of course, of the infamous Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. He actually was an associate with Lyell, and he came up with the idea that man evolved from simple single-cell organisms, and then through a series of species, man arose. And this directly contradicts the Bible story, where creation account, where God created man by his own breath in the 6th day of creation. So these theories at first were opposed, but they took foot in the scientific community and now have a very persuasive influence on all aspects of society. Later would arise the counterfeit science of abiogenesis, theorizing that the origin of life is a natural process by which life has arisen from non-living matter, such as simple organic compounds. Now, this came later in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with the development of the modern science of chemistry. And they began to understand organic structures and organic reactions, and then began to extrapolate this to how life arose on Earth without any divine intervention. So this is, once again, a counterfeit story. Then 2 gentlemen, Alexander Operum in 1924 and J.S. Haldane in 1929, proposed that the first molecules constituting the earliest cells slowly self-organized from a primordial soup, and that this theory is called the Operum-Haldane hypothesis. So anybody that goes into modern scientific training, goes into the high school or even middle school textbooks on biology or chemistry, will start off with where life came from, and then we'll talk about this primordial soup. There's this idea that a pool of simple chemicals and high energy, thermal, electrical energy could create the building blocks of life, the amino acids and the carbohydrates and the proteins and the fatty acids that gave rise to a cell, and then later to multicellular life's origins. And so these are all talked about, these stories, as if they're somehow true or proven, but they're, once again, all theories. And then in 1952, there was a famous experiment, the Miller-Urey experiment, which formed, in a laboratory, which formed simple amino acids from inorganic compounds in an electric arc. And this gave the idea that simple chemicals could come together with the right conditions and form the building blocks of life. And it's rather interesting. Myself, I am an organic chemist by training, so I understand the chemistry behind this. And the irony is that Miller-Urey did this experiment at the University of Montana. And at the time I became a Seventh-day Adventist in 1997, was a professor in that very university, in the very building where these experiments were carried out. So it's rather providential or ironic that I became converted as a Seventh-day Adventist by reading the Bible. And then I had to confront this problem because many of my colleagues were concerned And one of them approached me one day and says, "Well, Eric, you still believe in evolution, don't you?" And my response is, "Well, I never really made any sense to me." And he said, "Well, you don't believe in creation, do you?" And I said, "Well, certainly I do. Why not?" And so this began a process that they tried to convince me that that creation was just a wild fable, a story, but that I had to believe in evolution. And so I'd never really examined it carefully prior to that. And so I realized I had to look at it from the perspective as a scientist. And so I wasn't a geologist or a physicist, but as an organic chemist, I could certainly look at the results in the scientific literature on this idea of abiogenesis. Because a cell is a very complex machine with nucleic acids, genetic material, carbohydrates, in various compartments. It's just a fantastically complex system. Anybody who studies molecular biology or basic science will come to learn this. Where did all these components come from? Well, they're nothing but organic chemicals, different classes. How did they come together and form a single cell organism? Biological evolution starts from there and goes into the multicellular and the various organisms and animal species and so forth. But the question is, where does the first cell come from? And that is the realm of chemistry or biochemistry. Organic reactions run by enzymes, if you will. So there I was qualified. And so I took it upon myself to read almost 400 to 500 papers on this subject of abiogenesis or prebiotic chemistry. And guess what I found out? It's a hoax. There's nothing there. It's a total mirage. That it's all this hype, but these actual experiments where that they maybe form a trace amount of this piece or that piece out of and get a complex mixture of compounds, they do nothing to explain how you purify and isolate and how these things came together in ordered sequences and so forth. And it's all hype. It's all stories. And so I dared to expose this at a scientific conference. And of course, I knew that this was going to be academic suicide, but, God led me to the point where I had to follow the truth. So we're talking about a whole area of science which really isn't true science, because true scientists prior to, the 1800s, like, Isaac Newton and Galileo, were all God-fearing men. And they saw that science was the means by which God ordered and ruled the universe with laws and natural processes. And so they didn't see a conflict at all, but it was in the 1800s with Darwin and Lyell's publications that they began to shift away from a miraculous origin of life, sacred history, and replace it with a counterfeit story called evolution and natural selection. Evolution from chemical evolution, biological evolution, geological evolution. All these stories are now pervasive throughout the educational system, from grade school all the way up into the university level. So if you send a young person there, unless they're thoroughly grounded in the Bible truth, they will be converted into infidels. Well, I examined this stuff back around, over 20 years ago. Well, in subsequent decades from Miller-Urey experiment, hundreds of papers have been published making unfounded claims, and never has showed any concrete evidence of how life could arise from a, quote, primordial soup. There's nothing there. Well, we go back to inspiration, and Ellen White tells us in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 112, paragraph 1, that the days of creation are literal. This paragraph reads, "By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast." Psalm 33, 6 and 9. The Bible recognizes no long ages in which the earth was slowly evolved from chaos. Of each successive day of creation, the sacred record declares that it consisted of the evening and the morning, like all other days that followed. At the close of each day is given the result of the Creator's work. The statement is made at the close of the first week's record. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, Genesis 2:4. But this does not convey the idea that the days of the creation were other than literal days. Each day was called a generation because that in it God generated or produced some new portion of his work. So this is confirmation of the biblical narrative that life on earth arose in 6 literal, continuous 24-hour days. And then on the 7th day, God rested and blessed that day and hallowed it is the Sabbath day, the origin of the Sabbath. So the idea that these are long ages would totally destroy the Sabbath, which is a literal 24-hour day. So this is miraculous creation, or creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. God spoke and it stood fast. That is the miraculous record. So the evolutionary account is a counterfeit. It's trying to replace what God said. It's just amazing. Now, what about the geological record? The science of geology was certainly there in Ellen White's day, and she commented on this because of it's ironic that Lyell's book, The Principles of Geology, was published in what year? 1831. That's an interesting time frame, because what happened in 1831? That's an important date for the rise of the Adventist Church. That's the beginning of the Millerite movement. William Miller and preaching of the first angel's message. Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. So it's interesting that at the very time that God was raising up a prophetic movement, that Satan had the counterfeit narrative on principles of geology. But Ellen White commented on this. She said, geologists claim to find evidence from the earth itself that it's very much older than the Mosaic record teaches. Bones of men and animals, as well as instruments of warfare, petrified trees, etc., much larger than any that now exist or that have existed for thousands of years, have been discovered, and from this it is inferred that the earth was populated long before the time brought to view in the record of creation, and by a race of beings vastly superior in size to any men now living. Such reasoning has led many professed Bible believers to adopt the position that the days of creation were vast, indefinite periods. And so this leads into a false path, and people become infidels. So we have to look for another explanation about what we see in the fossil record and these relics and evidence of giants and large species before the flood. And so which record is correct, the Bible record or the arguments from modern science? So we have to be careful that science cannot usurp or contradict divine revelation through scriptures. They must harmonize. Science is subject to divine revelation, not superior to it. So Bible history is essential. And in the same publication, Patriarchs and Prophets, page 112, paragraph 3, it reads, but apart from Bible history, geology, and I put in brackets, as in modern times, chemistry, physics, or etc., any branch of science, can prove nothing. So you can't separate any branch of science from the Bible. It will prove absolutely nothing. Those who reason so confidently upon its discoveries have no adequate conception of the size of men, animals, and trees before the flood, or the great changes which then took place. Relics found in the earth do give evidence of conditions differing in many respects from the present, but the time when these conditions existed can be learned only from the inspired record. In the history of the flood, inspiration has explained that which geology alone could never fathom. In the days of Noah, men, animals, and trees, many times larger than now exist, were buried and thus preserved as an evidence to later generations that the antediluvians perished by a flood. God designed that the discovery of these things should establish faith in inspired history, but men, with their vain reasoning, fall into the same error as did the people before the flood. The things which God gave them as a benefit, they turn into a curse by making wrong use of them. Interesting here. So the explanation for the geological record and the fossils and the large creatures and all of that is found in the biblical record of Noah's flood. an antediluvian world that existed before the flood. But uninspired men try to counteract that and turn the blessings that God has provided for us in the geological record and turn it from a benefit and turn it into a curse. And that curse is the theories of evolution that's taught throughout the school system. So the question becomes prebiotic chemistry or abiogenesis. And that's this idea that we came from a primordial soup and then a bunch of chemicals came together and eventually formed some protocell and then multicellular systems and then eventually living creatures. This is contrasted with the biblical story. Well, what's interesting here is there's been a series of presentations by this man, James Tour. He's a professor, distinguished professor at Rice University. He's an organic chemistry professor. And he did a series of lectures, 13 of them, critiquing the modern science of abiogenesis and many common misconceptions. It was rather interesting that this gentleman, I know him personally. We worked together for the same professor at Stanford University many years ago. And at that time, Professor Tour was a very devout Christian, and I was not. He used to invite people to Bible studies, and others of us kind of mocked him. But what was interesting is he got involved in academics and became very successful. This man has published over 700 scientific papers. He has large patent families. He's self-funded, a very distinguished, impeccable research record. And when he addressed the issue of abiogenesis, he took it merely from a scientific perspective. He wasn't trying to prove the Bible one way or another. He was simply looking what evidence is there in the scientific literature to make the claim that life came from primordial soup. And the answer is, just as I discovered when I read all the papers back around the late 1990s, is there's nothing there. It's a total mirage. It's total hype. And so he goes through this 13-part series and critiques it point by point, examining the actual papers themselves and showing that the science is fatally flawed and it's full of hype. And what was interesting is I visited him at Rice when I went to do some research related to the Shepherd's Rod message, 2020, and I met with him and explained my conversion to Christ, and he was very happy with that. But he said he's working on the series, and he asked me to help him proofread it, which I happily obliged. Had to dust off my knowledge, but it came back quickly. And so that he could verify, because he presents this out to the world and invites any organic chemistry, all of his colleagues, to show him where he's wrong. Of course, he's not wrong. He understands the chemistry, and he points out the fatalistic flaws of all this abiogenesis research. They have absolutely nothing, and they probably will never come up with anything. And so he's followed that up with a series that's ongoing right now, critiquing people that are trying to defend abiogenesis. Of course, it's a hopeless cause. So if anybody's interested in the critique of abiogenesis, you can check that series out under his name. Interesting stuff if you want to learn about the science, but it's really showing you that the scientific community has gone astray and has nothing to offer in the place, it has a counterfeit history, contrary to what is in the Bible. Let's move on to the next area. Did you know the Pope had a secret army? Do you know who that army is? Well, here's one of their symbols, and of course this is none other than the Jesuits. This is a organization that was set up by St. Ignatius Loyola as a counter to the Reformation. It's often called the Counter-Reformation, and they're responsible for a long series of heinous crimes against humanity called the Inquisition. But they currently exist, and they're sometimes called the Black Pope. The head of the Jesuits, the Jesuit general, is sometimes called the Black Pope, behind the visible white Pope. And this is the army that goes around and infiltrates institutions at every level, religious, academic, media, governmental, and uses as the means to corrupt and defile everything that's good on the earth. And so the role of Jesuits in coming up with profane or counterfeit history needs to be understood. So we're going to look at a little bit about how Jesuits revise history. And we're going to read from a publication, a book called Jesuit Plots from the Elizabethan to the Modern Times, written by Albert Close. And this reads, "For 300 years past, the Church of Rome has striven by an unceasing torrent of false histories, pamphlets, and lectures to conceal from the nation, that is Great Britain, and the world the true face of her terrible history before and during the Reformation. The greatest danger and damage to true British history today lies in the almost criminal folly of the British government appointing Roman Catholics and Anglo-Romanists to edit the official calendars of state papers from the original manuscripts of the Reformation times. By clever maneuvering, Rome, i.e. the Vatican, the papacy, has succeeded in getting Roman Catholic calendars on the staff of the Master of the Rolls, with the result that Vatican documents and other old state papers have either been suppressed in our national calendars of state papers or edited in favor of the Church of Rome." So this is documenting how the Jesuits work. They get in control of government institutions and academic institutions, and they rewrite history that's unfavorable to the nature of the Roman Church and its corruption, and they sanitize it. And they do this at the very highest levels, not only in Great Britain, but in countries around the world. And their pervasive influence is seen everywhere. We continue on, page 169 of this book. "The Vatican has for centuries instructed its agents, that is, Jesuits, Knights of Malta, Knights of Columbus, etc., to infiltrate governments, other religious denominations, intelligence agencies, universities and colleges, school board committees, publishing houses, etc., in a carefully planned and orchestrated effort to erase, as much as possible, the Vatican's history of religious genocide and persecution, of fomenting revolutions and wars, of assassinating heads of states, and of torture and inquisition, and also to rewrite and revise history textbooks and encyclopedias. This effort has been immensely successful. There can be no shadow of doubt that the Jesuits and the Anglo-Romanist party in Britain have gained great influence over the cable services, press agencies, the BBC, and chief newspapers of Great Britain." So this is showing you how they work. They infiltrate governments, religious denominations, universities, colleges, even down to school board committees, publishing houses, to corrupt, to erase history that's not favorable to Rome, and then carry out all this dirty work. If you want to know why the world is so corrupt and defiled, why they're teaching transgenderism in school curriculums and all kinds of pushing abortion everywhere, you want to know who's behind it. Well, you can go to alternative media, but very few people will really call out and identify the masterminds behind it, which is the Jesuits, the secret agents of Rome. They'll talk about this political party or that political party, but they really don't talk about who's working behind the scenes. And this is the Jesuits, how they work by history. They rewrite and revise history textbooks and encyclopedias. And this is how we get a counterfeit historical narrative. American history, same thing. I mean, this is true in Britain. How about the United States? It's true there. They control the media, and they are destroying the founding of American principles. And you wonder why young people go to colleges and come out woke and, destroyed with all these crazy ideas and having no faith in God and the Bible. It's because they're exposed to all this counterfeit theories and ideas, socialism, Marxism, transgenderism. All of this stuff is the secret work of the Jesuits. And the Jesuits have a dark past. The end justifies the mean. Ellen White talks about them in Great Controversy, page 236. She says, "Throughout Christendom, Protestantism was menaced by formidable foes. The first triumphs of the Reformation past, Rome summoned new forces. hoping to accomplish its destruction. At this time, the order of the Jesuits was created, the most cruel, unscrupulous, and powerful of all the champions of popery. Cut off from earthly ties and human interest, dead to the claims of natural affection, reason and conscience, holy science, they knew no rule, no tie, but that of their order, no duty but to extend its power. It was a fundamental principle of the order that the end justifies the means. By this code, lying, theft, perjury, assassination were not only pardonable, but commendable, and when they served the interest of the Church. Under the various disguises, the Jesuits worked their way into offices of state, climbing up to be the counselors of kings and shaping the policy of nations. They became servants to act as spies upon their masters. They established colleges for the sons of princes and nobles, and schools for the common people, and the children of Protestant parents were drawn into an observance of popish rites. Stop and think for a second. Do you think it's possible that the Jesuits have infiltrated the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its institutions, its colleges, and its schools? It's obvious. Look at the product of those institutions. I myself was one for a while, and I saw all kinds of strange, abominable things. And the teachers in that college that were teaching Protestant history or Reformation history were clearly a Jesuit. They were counteracting and degrading the reformers and presenting a story favorable to Rome. And these poor college students, all these Adventist students, were exposed to this, and they partook in every sin there. Fornication was rampant. Even the highest leaders in the church turned their heads the other way. So yes, this is how Rome corrupts, through their secret army, the Jesuits. Ellen White warned us about it. We should be wise to recognize how they work in our midst. Well, fortunately, God has preserved the truth, sacred history, and one of the most important history books ever published outside the Bible is this book, The Great Controversy Between Christ and Satan, written by Ellen White. And here from the prefix Roman numeral 11, Sister White says, "As the Spirit of God has opened to my mind the great truths of His Word in the scenes of the past and the future, I have been bidden to make known to others that which has thus been revealed, to trace the history of the controversy in past ages, and especially so to present it as to shed a light on the fast approaching struggle of the future. The great events in which have marked the progress of reform in past ages are matters of history well known and universally acknowledged by the Protestant world. They are facts which none can gainsay, the facts having been condensed into as little space as seemed consistent with a proper understanding of their application." So the facts of who we are and where we come from, and especially the Reformation, and of course the Great Controversy covers the period from the fall of Rome in 70 A.D. all the way through the Dark Ages and the rise of the Reformers and the French Revolution. Well, where did Ellen White get all of that information, all those facts? Well, especially in light that she only had a third-grade education. Well, surprise, surprise, Ellen White was quite a student, and she read history books, and she used those histories, the true history that had been recorded over the ages, to give us a condensed version. Thank God for this. And we're going to learn more about how that was put together. So Ellen White made great use of historical books. And this is coming from a book by F.M. Wilcox called The Testimony of Jesus, published in 1944, page 114, explaining how Ellen White used historical resources. Much of this history, talking about the Reformation, had passed before her in vision, but not all the details and not always in precise sequence. In a statement read on October 30, 1911, carrying Ellen White's written endorsement, Willie White, her son, said, "She, Ellen, made use of good and clear historical statements to help make plain to the reader the things which she is endeavoring to present. When I was a mere boy, I heard her read D'Abergain's History of the Reformation to my father. She read to him a large part, if not the whole, of the 5 volumes. She has read other histories of the Reformation. This has helped her to locate and describe many of the events and the movements presented to her in vision. Remarkable. So you see a key insight how Ellen White put together the narrative, the sacred history of God raising up the Reformation. She read history books, and lots of them. Have any of you ever read D'Abergain's History of the Reformation, all 5 volumes? I doubt many of us have. But thank God that's a lot of reading. Okay, they didn't have the internet and all these distractions that we have today, cell phones and so forth. So they spent a lot of time reading. So Ellen White was truly a scholar of her own right. She understood history because she read correct history. And then Ellen White, The Lonely Years. This is the biography done by her grandson, Arthur White, Volume 3, page 434 and up through 443. It reads, the 1884 Great Controversy. Ellen White quoted from D'Abergain, Wiley, etc. In this enlargement, talking about from the prior edition, Spirit Prophecy, Volume 4, in this enlargement, she brought in considerably more of such materials, that is, historical writings. At times she quoted, at times paraphrased, and at times depicted in her own words the events of history that formed the vehicle for presenting the larger picture, the behind-the-scenes controversy that had been opened up to her in vision. In keeping with the thinking of those times, she and those associated with her, her assistants, did not consider this use of available materials as a matter that called for specific recognition, talking about her quoting actually large portions from historical writings, especially regarding the French Revolution and the Reformation history. So Ellen White spent a lot of time studying history and used that to put together what God showed her in vision, to put together a comprehensive narrative in the Great Controversy. It was a spectacular work, and one that Satan despised and wanted to be erased because it showed the behind the scenes what was really going on. We should be very grateful to God for this work. Now, anybody know what Ellen White's library looked like? I met a Seventh-day Adventist evangelist. His name was Stephen Wallace, and he lived in Montana. And he was he used to work at the White Estate. And I visited his home one time when I was a young Adventist. It was around the year 1999. And he was trying to recreate Ellen White's personal library. And he had a fantastic collection of books, but many of those books were exceedingly rare and hard to find. Why? Because they told the true story of the Reformation. And guess what? The Pope's secret army, the Jesuits, liked to go around the world to libraries and destroy those books because they told the truth, and then put into place their own revised books. So some of these books are very hard to come by. Well, I'm just going to cite some that she used for the Great Controversy. Of course, D'Abergain, History of the Reformation, the 16th Century in Germany, 4 volumes, published 1846. Same author, History of the Reformation in Europe, the time of Calvin, 2 volumes, published 1863. Next volume, History of the Reformation, 16th Century, revised, published 1853, 5 volumes. That's what she read to her husband. How about Adolphe Thiers, The History of the French Revolution, published 1848, 4 volumes. We're talking about lots of documentation here. Mark Wilkes, History of the Persecutions Endured by the Protestants of Southern France, published 1821. These are rare books. I mean, you don't, to find these things today, if you could even find them, you would spend large sums of money. They're very rare books. Or James Wiley, The History of the Protestantism, first edition, 1876, 3 volumes. So this is just in the sampling. And then James Wiley, History of the Waldenses, published 1880. Ellen White had these in her library. Today, many of these books are very hard to come by. There might be some electronic versions, but who of us have read through these books? I doubt any of us. But Ellen White did read through these books. And that was how she be able to put together the historical sacred history found in Great Controversy and other of her writings. Now, this is only the tip of the iceberg. There's an actual list of the whole catalog of books in her personal library, and it's absolutely phenomenal. Hundreds and hundreds of books, are very rare books that are hard to find because, of course, the Jesuits went around the world trying to destroy this history. But we thank God that it's been preserved, and you can still locate those in the White Estate and at the Center of Adventist Research at Andrews University. So much of that content has been preserved, and we're thankful to God for that. But Ellen White was a student of history, and that should be a counsel to us to not be lazy and study our history as a people. Okay? So Ellen White was a true historical scholar. She understood the proper philosophy of history. Now, what about the shepherd's rod? Well, it's interesting that the shepherd's rod is a confirmation of the history that was shown in Ellen White's writings. For example, here in this illustration of the grains of Ezekiel 4 show the steps of the Reformation through the various grains and the various architects of the various steps of the Reformation. Luther, Knox, Wesley, Campbell, Miller, and Ellen White, all these doctrines gathered into one vessel, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So this is confirmed, and Seventh-day Adventists have no idea about this vision in Ezekiel 4, but this is a confirmation of the sacred history already revealed in the Great Controversy. Now, why do I show this? Well, you notice, is it possible that Davidians have revised or corrupted our history? And the answer is absolutely. We've documented this in videos, many videos, about how Davidians have changed the artwork, the charts, and here's one of them on Ezekiel 4. Notice all the areas highlighted in yellow. Well, there was a Davidian that took all those out and replaced it with this counterfeit. This, of course, is the work of Wanda Bloom, the second wife of Don Adair, who started the Cal Mesa Association that broke off from Yucaipa in 1983. So she comes up with this amalgamated chart and adds all the areas in gray, adds these illustrations. Did God authorize her to do that? No. And strips out all the content from the original. Why did they do that? Who authorized? Well, God certainly didn't. It's because they didn't understand it. So this is, once again, modern-day historical revisionism that is very dangerous, gives us a counterfeit. And the irony is that most of the Davidian associations, Salem, Mountaindale, and Waco, all use this chart. And when confronted this, why do they continue to justify using this when it is a counterfeit? So yes, unfortunately, historical revisionism is very active and well amongst Davidians since the death of Brother Haddon. This is just one example. Let's look at some facts about the 1888 message. Now, we did a whole video on this. You can check a link in the description box below why this is so important and why there are things about this message that even Seventh-day Adventists don't understand and why it's so important. It's part of our sacred history. Well, the 1888 message was brought by Elders Jones and Wagner, and it was the righteousness of Christ, which was the end goal of the gospel. That was to be obtained by believers by righteousness by faith. So the end goal of the gospel was to reproduce the character of Christ fully in fallen man by faith. So that was the essence of the message. Most of the Seventh-day Adventist church leaders rejected the message and even mocked the messengers. By 1890, the body of the Seventh-day Adventist church had the opportunity to hear the message as it was advanced by Jones, Wagner, and Sister White herself. Unfortunately, most rejected the teaching, and they scattered Jones, Wagner, and Ellen White, sent her off to Australia, and separated them. Had the message been accepted, this is the startling fact, had the message been accepted, the loud cry would have commenced and closed the gospel within a few years. That's an irreconcilable fact. The fact that we're still here says that something went wrong, that we have missed something. As a result of rejecting Christ through his messengers, the church entered a 40-year wilderness wandering, as explained by Elder Taylor Bunch and others. This is just prior to the shepherd's rod. This is history that most Adventists have no idea about. They're trying to whitewash it, about the 40-year wilderness wandering starting in 1890. In 1930, The message returned in the form of a strong warning announcing the great and dreadful day of the Lord, Malachi 4:5, the sealing of the 144,000, and the soon coming of the judgment of the living. This, of course, was none other than the writings of the shepherd's rod. It also, all these events were prophetically predicted in the 430-year prophecy found in Ezekiel chapter 4. Nowhere else in the world can Adventists explain this 430 years broken into two sections, 390 and 40 years. Now, we have a video on that as well to explain that vision in its correlation with the Reformation history and the 1888 message. So this is part of the sacred history that is found and preserved in the shepherd's rod. And Seventh-day Adventists need to know this because they've been fed a counterfeit. What am I talking about? Well, when it comes to understanding about 1888, we recommend in the video, our prior video, this is the only recommended reading. 1888 materials. These are comments from Ellen White, anything related to that message before and after. These 4-volume sets, unfortunately, is out of print. Very hard to get and quite expensive. Occasionally they'll show up on eBay or whatever. You can get electronic versions. So that's one source. Ellen White was there. Another source, A.G. Daniels, Christ or Righteousness, is even quoted by Brother Hatoff several times in the Rod. A.G. Daniels was an eyewitness. He was in attendance of the 1888 message. And so this is an important source of commentary on the nature of the message. And then a later research, 1888, re-examined by two Adventist scholars, Whelan and Short, give us a lot of history about the nature of the message. Unfortunately, it doesn't give the divine remedy, of which is found, of course, in the shepherd's rod. But this is an accurate information on the history of 1888, if you really want to know what it was about. And then, of course, the writings of Jones and Wagner themselves. Contrast this with the counterfeit, corrupted history about 1888. This is the stuff you do not want to read. These are the books that you'll find and the information you'll find today in the Adventist bookstores and on the internet. For example, over on the left here, a user-friendly guide to the 1888 message by George Knight. Well, who's George Knight? He's a historical revisionist. So they're going to tell you, oh, what's the 1888 message about? Why was it so controversial? And what's it to do with me? I can guarantee you that this is a counterfeit. It's a piece of garbage. It will tell you things about that message that are not in harmony with the people that were there as eyewitnesses. So it's a decoy. Or how about this message to the young people by a prominent popular pastor, Ivor Myers, all over the internet? The 1888 message and what we missed. And his story is a counterfeit. What they're going to miss is the truth if you listen to Ivor Myers. So if you want to know the truth, then read the Spirit of Prophecy and read Christ or Righteousness. Read the Shepherd's Rod. You won't find that in Ivor Myers. So this is a counterfeit. It's a decoy, revisionist history. And even conservative Adventists, the suspenders wearing, believe in the Spirit of Prophecy. Ron Spear published a book many years ago, The Message of 1888. The problem with this is it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't talk about the 40-year wilderness wandering. It doesn't talk about the divine remedy that the message was to return. And certainly Ron Spear knows about the shepherd's rod, but he hates it. So he's hiding, he's omitting important aspects about that message and the prediction that would return and the nature of the message. So, yes, it gives some details, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So all of this stuff will decoy you off into the ditch. So it's worthless. Stick to the original. Now we get to the present day. Is it possible that Davidians engage in historical revisionism? Well, just think about this for a minute. If it's happened throughout every age, it's certainly we should expect it. And the answer is absolutely yes. I'll give you a couple examples. 2 videos that have shown up on YouTube. Over here on the left, we have one by Golden Bowl Ministries. This is a ministry of Mountaindale Association, and it's called the Shepherd's Rod History. So this is a 2-hour and 36-minute presentation. It was published about 3 years ago. And here's shown this group of leaders, members of their executive council, and they're going to tell us the history. So do we get the true history, or do we get a counterfeit? And the answer is we get a total counterfeit. This was nothing but a hit piece. Most of the people got up and grandstanded and told stories. There was a little bit of history in there. The two gentlemen on the right-hand side, Brother JJ, and Terry Harrison, told a little bit of history relative to Mountaindale. But for the most part, it was just stories. And its real purpose is at the end, Mountaindale's chief prophet of Baal, Errol Stanford, used it to talk about David Koresh. What does David Koresh have to do with Mountaindale history? He used it as a means to associate it with me, Eric Edstrom, and UPA7.org, guilt by association. So it was a thinly veiled hit piece. That's all this is. Was it true Shepherd's Rod history? No. It was a counterfeit. It was a bunch of storytelling. But it was really used as a means to discredit the work that God is doing through UPA7.org. That's the truth. Or what about this history, this video done a couple years ago by Rob Peralta? Counterfeit history. And we're going to learn where he got his information. But just look at this slide here. He's showing, at this time, of course, Rod Peralta was a loyalist supporting Mountaindale and Waco as God's storehouses. So when he talks about examples of the tract, look at that tract literature. Does that look like the original? The answer is no. It's a counterfeit publications. Counterfeit literature, counterfeit history. So the narrative in this presentation is fragmented, incomplete, and revised. It's not true history. And we'll look at a little more detail because we're going to see how it manifests itself here recently. In Peralta's video, his primary source of information is this book called The Davidian Testimony. It's a publication by Don Adair. So the question becomes, is this book reveal our true history? Well, let's look at it. If you don't have it, you can read it for yourself. But it is a testimony of Don Adair's personal experiences as Davidian. He came into the Shepherd's Rod message by contact with Ben Roden in the early 1950s. He later separated from Roden, was a student at the DLI at Old Mount Carmel, 1954-55, under Brother Houteff. But he was never authorized to be a hunter. Brother Houteff saw a problem with him. So this is his story, his testimony. That's fine. It does have some useful historical content. We're not dismissing the whole book. It does tell us a lot about people like Ben Roden, who they are, what they taught, things they did. So there's some information there. However, it does have a very strong bias towards to justify the Salem Association that Don Adair usurped and took over in 1974 and has been in control of ever since until about the last year or so. Don Adair's up in his 90s, and the Salem Associations are breaking apart into pieces and being taken over by other people. So this has always been a justification for Salem. Another feature of it is it has incomplete historical details. It's very limited discussion about Yucaipa, and this is important. We're going to see why this is crucial, because people kind of want to side swipe it or ignore Yucaipa, but Yucaipa is critical to the foundation of Mountaindale. And because Don Adair had a hostile split with Mountaindale and Anthony Hibbert in the early 1880s, the testimony about Mountaindale is very derogative. He calls them Jamaican rebels. Okay, so this is a very biased history. And most history books, to be honest, are biased from the perspective of the author based on what database they have, what information they have, and what their personal beliefs are. So this is certainly the case. Is there useful information in the book? Absolutely. Is it our correct history? No, it is not. It's the history according to Don Adair to justify Salem and their various doctrines, new codes, and so forth. So you can learn some stuff from this, but it is not the final answer to our history. Do other Davidians engage in historical revisionism? The answer is yes. Here's another website that has copycatted what UPA7.org has done, We're the first to publish a lot of very important historical documents about various periods of the movement of God's Storehouse over time. And a lot of this information was picked up and incorporated on this website, which is authored by none other than this imposter, Lennox Sam, who thinks he's antitypical King David, the antitypical Elijah. So yes, they have their historical narrative, but once again, it's largely to justify relocation back to Waco, not under Norman Archer, but under Lennox Sam 11th Hour Church movement. This is very popular, especially in Africa. So once again, you have true history, historical documents mixed with counterfeit. So how do you know who's right and who's wrong? If you look back since the death of Brother Houteff, there's so many factions that have risen. And guess what? Each one has their own history. This is just some of them. Or in chronological order, you have the rise of the Branch Davidians in Bend Road in 1955, Bashan Hill under M.J. Bingham that broke away from Warden in the Vista Association in 1962. You have Don Adair taking over the Salem Association, so you got GADSTA Salem, also a Mount Carmel Center, that Don Adair took over in 1974. You have International GADSTA Red Bluff, which was started by Wanda Bloom and Erwin Reichman, who broke away from Ukaipa Association in 1983. Now, we've documented all this in prior videos. You can check a link in the description box below. We have this all detailed, the true history or lineage of who God used to preserve the truth of the original shepherd's rod over this time. Later, we have GADSDA Mountaindale, another rival Mount Carmel Center that arose, that merged with Ukaipa in 1986. Mountaindale was a cast out of Salem in the early 80s. They didn't have literature, but they merged with Mountaindale. We have a video on talking about splinters and merges amongst Davidian groups. This is a very important merger, a very important part of the history that a lot of people want to ignore or overlook. Next, you have the Waco group under Norman Archer that broke away from Mountaindale in 1991, another rival Mount Carmel Center. You have the Gileadites, M.T. Jordan out of Canada, that broke off from Bashan pasture late 1990s. You have the Heralds of the King, started by Roland Roberts and Garrick Augustus. They kind of broke out of, Garrick Augustus was with Mountaindale for a while, but they started this idea that antitypical David is Christ. Of course, that is false. This ministry has been active. They've kind of disappeared on the internet lately, but they started around 2000. Mustard Seed Advent, Derek West was another splinter off of Bashan, became public in 2005. GADST Tennessee arose from the split in Mountaindale in 2005. I put the red X through it because this association is pretty much broken apart and dissembled, so they're no longer in existence. But they've been replaced by the latest breakaway from Mountaindale, number 11, none other than the pre-11th Hour ministry that split from Mountaindale over dispute over the new codes in 2022. So in all this maze, everybody has their own history. Who's right and who's wrong? So you have to have the facts for yourself. Well, recently, this pre-11th Hour ministry did a blog post and a presentation on a look at Davidian history. So the question is this sacred history or is it profane? Is it a counterfeit revised history? So here's a video published on YouTube about a week ago. This is mid-January 2023. And this meeting took place 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was a presentation by Rob Peralta and his ideas of Davidian history. Rather interesting questions asked around the 42-minute mark. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you go check it out for yourself. But what can we learn from this history that was on the blog post and in this presentation? Peralta introduces this very illogical 4DSTA grace/limbo periods argument, where he comes up with this idea that the 4 periods are where the transfer from the Storehouse from the Seventh-day Adventist Church to Mount Carmel Center, Waco, Texas, 1934. Okay, that was the first one. The next movement was the transfer of the Storehouse from Florence Houteff to the 100% Rod-only Davidians that took place in 1961. The third period was the transfer of the Storehouse from, he jumps to Salem, and then it transfers from Salem to Mount Dale, early 1980s. And then the last period is the transfer from Mount Dale to pre-11th hour that took place here in the fall of 2022. Is this logical? Is this in harmony with the facts, the documents that have been presented? The answer is absolutely not. He made this stuff up. It's a counterfeit of the logical, factual, historical narrative that we published in a 6-part series on the history of God's Storehouse, but we showed the true lineage of UPA 7 starting, or Universal Publishing starting 1930 under Victor Houteff, and how it moved in every era, 6 different times, ending up in Mountaindale, and now the 7th version, UPA 7 worldwide. So he's counterfeiting that with his 4 grace limbo periods. Where did he get this stuff from? He made it up. So what's the problem with this? Well, it's incomplete. It's a fragmented narrative, and there's a blatant, glaring admission. He completely skips Yucaipa. And the irony is, during this presentation, there were 2 sisters there that were part of the Yucaipa Association. And they asked the question, well, why did you leave out Yucaipa? We were in agreement with Donna Adair, and that's true. And Peralta couldn't answer it. He just avoids it. So he's selectively deleting part of the Storehouse history. You can't do that. Another big problem is he has no key to identify God's Storehouse from the period of 1955 to the present. He has no logical argument. The key, as we've identified, is who is it that preserved the original Shepherd's Rod message, the actual tract literature. That's the key. When you follow that, then you can see who God has led, because everybody else that's splintered off has a counterfeit literature, counterfeit artwork. So that's it. So he has no key. His is this illogical 4 grace limbo periods. Revised history. As well, he's heavily dependent on Adair's history. So he goes from Vista, California, the 100% Rod-only Davidians, and then just jumps into Salem. Okay. Yes, it's true. It moved to Salem in 1970, but it didn't stay there. Adair usurped, took over. In 74, faithful Davidians opposed Adair, hijacking the symbolic code and introducing false doctrines, and relocated back in Yucaipa. Peralta ignores that because he's listening to Adair, because Adair ignores it, because that's the truth. Yucaipa is the key. The Storehouse went back to Yucaipa, California in 1974, and it was Yucaipa that merged with Mount Dale that was kicked out, the Jamaicans kicked out by Don Adair. They had nothing. It was when they found out about Yucaipa. Yucaipa had the printing press. They had the printing plates. This was testified by Terry Harrison there. He knew. He was part of it. And they brought the printing and the original literature to Mount Dale and merged in 1986. Those are absolute, irrefutable facts. Why is it Peralta's ignoring them? Because it doesn't fit his story, his revisionist history. So and furthermore, this is a blatant admission. They totally ignore the events and circumstances leading up to the 2005 Mount Dale split. Peralta wasn't there. Why is he skipping it? I was there, and many other people. But what happened in 2005, Mount Dale, yes, did publish original literature from 86 up until around 2000. Then they began to, printing plates wore out, and they began to retypeset. And by 2005, Mount Dale was no longer printing original literature. So out of necessity, God had to raise up UPA 7 to reestablish original Rod literature. At the time, we were concerned about the Philippines. Mountaindale didn't care. They went to the zoo, right? They took off and went to the zoo. They didn't have any interest about seeing that work, getting a publishing house started up in the Philippines. So we had to do it out of necessity. What we found out later was it was not a problem not only for the Philippines, but it was a worldwide problem everywhere, all around Africa and everywhere. And that's why we rose up and restored the original Rod message and offered it for people anywhere in the world to publish their own literature and no longer depend on these corrupted associations. So yeah, UPA 7 launched in 2008. That shook the Davidian world. And now we're helping brethren around the world set up their own publishing houses, and they're very happy how to organize and use their tithe and offerings to set up a legitimate 100% Rod-only publishing house. That's the true history. And the pre-11th hour ministry is trying to ignore that because they're a counterfeit. That's the truth. So the movement of God's publishing house from 1930 to 2005 started in California. 1935 goes to Waco, Texas. Brother Hadif dies. It reorganizes back in California, 1961, Vista. Then it moves to Salem in 1970. Don Adair usurps in 1974. So the faithful separate, reorganize back in Yucaipa, 1974. Then later a group that got kicked out by Salem and Mountaindale find out about Yucaipa, and Yucaipa merges with Mountaindale in 1986. So that's the sixth version of UPA, and then the seventh arose in 2005 to go worldwide. And we've got presentations, but we talk about this, the scattering time. So this historical review, the various publishing houses, Vista, Salem, Yucaipa, Mountaindale, and now UP7 worldwide. So they're cutting out Yucaipa. You can't do that. That means your history is revised. It's a counterfeit. It's profane. So God's Storehouse is not restricted to one location in the United States. It's being established in locations around the world to reach the 20 million 70 Adventists scattered around the world. Those are the facts, whether they're believed or not. So what can we summarize in our review here? Well, from Genesis to Revelation, sacred history is an integral part of biblical knowledge and experience to understand how God has led his people in the past and how he's leading the faithful today. We should be extremely grateful for the labors of Ellen White in preserving the history of the Reformation in a highly condensed format in the Great Controversy, so that we do not have to locate and read extremely rare books of a considerable length. Thank God for that. The role of the Pope's secret army, the Jesuits, needs to be recognized as one of the most powerful forces controlling nearly all earthly institutions, with corrupted principles and revisionist history to hide the dark sins of Rome over the ages and to corrupt legions of youth and in society as a whole. Within the Adventist trajectory, we need to understand the history of the 1888 message and how it is being fulfilled through the Shepherd's Rod message today. And finally, today we need to be extremely guarded by the many counterfeit historical narratives that are being peddled amongst various Davidian splinter groups. By what criteria are we going to be able to determine who has the truth and who are pushing cunningly devised fables? That's a question, friends, that you have to study and investigate for yourself. Despise not prophesying, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. So this concludes our presentation. If you have any further questions, comments on this subject, you want any documentation, any more information about the history of God's Storehouse from Genesis to Revelation, then please subscribe to this YouTube channel, Universal Publishing Association, for future updates. Request copies of the original Shepherd's Rod tract literature for your own study, or for assistance to set up and establish your own Shepherd's Rod publishing house in your area. Then feel free to contact us anytime. Here's our email, phone number. You can call, text, or connect with us on WhatsApp or one of our websites, yparish.org. And these are contacts. These are some of the publishing houses that we have established so far: South Africa, Zimbabwe, United States, South Pacific Islands of Vanuatu, Zambia, Malawi, contact information. We have websites, video channels, social media platforms. So, yes, brethren, if you want to advance the shepherd's rod all the way to the kingdom, then please join with us, and we'll help you set up your own publishing house. We thank you for your time. May God richly bless your search for truth as for hidden treasure, and to cease ye from man, whose breath is in his nostrils. Godspeed.